At the beginning of this tale, you are invited to relax your breathing slowly while allowing your mind to enter a gentle space. Like the first page of an old book opened after a long period of rest. Imagine a room lit by a dim oil flame that does not disturb the eyes, and instead brings the sense that time is slowing down. In front of you rests an object that appears simple, yet carries a long history that cannot be easily untangled. This is an ancient codex, once considered by medieval scholars to be a living manuscript. Because each time night fell, the lines of ink inside it seemed to shift as if taking a breath of their own. No sound ever came from this object, yet many witnesses claimed. They felt a soft vibration, as though the ink was moving with a quiet rhythm beyond scientific explanation. In this moment, you are not asked to understand everything at once, only to allow yourself to sit in calmness and follow the flow of history slowly, like water moving between old stones. You may imagine your fingertips touching the surface of the leather cover, polished by time smooth, yet crossed by delicate cracks that reveal its long age. You may sense the slightly humid air carrying the tranquil scent of library dust and the curiosity that grows gently without disturbing your comfort. This is an invitation to explore the Codex mystery with an unhurried rhythm, as if walking down a corridor lined with watchful yet non-judgmental shelves. Before we step into the darker layers of history, take a moment to ease your shoulders and feel your body in a safe place, ready to follow the traces of the scribes who once held this codex. Everything begins from this point, a slow step toward a world where ink was believed to live, and every page carried a story that might change before your eyes could memorize it. The year that marks the beginning of the Codex investigation is usually placed around the late 13th century, when Europe was entering a period of major transformation in the world of knowledge, and scribes began to face pressure from authorities attempting to control the movement of information. Imagine a remote monastery in the Burgundy region, surrounded by dense forests and rocky hills that always glistened with morning mist. According to fragmented records, this is where the Codex was first kept by an archivist whose name appears only once in an inventory sheet without any further description. The archive room itself was described as a narrow chamber with cold stone walls and old wooden shelves that creaked whenever touched by the night wind. Historians who studied this place described an atmosphere that felt calm yet pressed with a sense of being watched from behind the piles of scrolls and steel leather-bound books. You may picture yourself standing there, sensing the damp stone floor, holding unknown footprints, while in the corner stood a small chest that once held the Codex before it changed hands many times. In that era, many manuscripts were treated with extreme caution, especially those showing unusual writing behavior, such as ink patterns that thickened at night, or pages that shifted their order without human involvement. Some records mention that the monks repeatedly reported similar phenomena, but avoided writing them in, full fearing they might violate the strict oversight of knowledge enforced by ecclesiastical authorities. In your imagination, you may see a scribe working under trembling candlelight, examining the Codex with a mixture of anxiety and awe. Such a setting reveals how the place and time offered the perfect background for the emergence of what would later be known as the living manuscript. All these small details guide you deeper into a historical space that feels real and quiet, as though every wall still holds the echo of those who once guarded it. As you begin tracing the journey of this codex, from its first monastery to its next place of storage, you will notice that each relocation leaves behind a confusing gap in the record, as though the scribes and archivists of this time were never entirely certain how to describe the manuscript and its behavior. Around the year 1340, a small disaster struck the Burgundy monastery when part of the library roof collapsed after prolonged heavy rain, forcing several manuscripts to be relocated to a scriptorial center in a small town near the Saône River. This transfer appears in a short, surviving report within the inventory sheet, yet the line mentioning the mysterious codex is written in noticeably darker ink than the rest, as if added at a different time. Paleographic experts who examined the document concluded that 2 or 3 layers of writing overlap on that line, suggesting that the identity and status of the codex were edited multiple times. You may imagine a monk hurriedly lifting a wooden box filled with damp manuscripts, pausing when he sensed the codex emitting a faint warmth of ink, even though ink has no reason to produce any scent or heat. As the box was carried down the slippery stone steps, perhaps there was a subtle feeling that the codex shifted its weight, not physically heavy, but heavy in presence. In the new scriptorial hall, which was far busier with the constant scratching of quills during the day, some accounts mention that the codex appeared more active when the room was quietest. At night, when only the wind could be heard brushing through a narrow window. Old city records preserve complaints from scribes who felt uneasy because the pages of the codex sometimes changed texture, becoming rougher or smoother depending on the night cycle. All these small clues suggest that from its earliest days, the codex displayed behaviors that refused natural explanation, inviting you to step closer and observe how history quietly recorded an anomaly beyond understanding. When the codex finally remained for several decades in the scriptorial hall near the Saône River, modern researchers discovered that this period produced some of the most detailed testimonies about its strange behavior, even though those records are scattered across unrelated documents. Imagine a large room with long oak tables, their surfaces marked by scratches from quills and hardened wax stains. Here scribes worked from morning until dusk, copying legal texts, theology, and travel accounts. Yet there was always one small desk that no scribe occupied for more than one night because they felt uneasy being too close to the codex. Some notes mention that when night arrived and only 1 or 2 monks stayed to watch the room, the sounds were no longer just wind or wood settling, but whispers seeming to come from the codex pages, as though the ink embedded in the parchment was shifting in patterns unseen. Picture a monk awake past midnight, telling himself that the sound was merely air echoing through narrow hallways, even as he caught a faint glimmer across an open page like a thin film of fresh liquid, though he knew no quill had touched the codex for hours. Modern conservation experts who reviewed these accounts suggested possible visual illusions caused by dim lighting, yet they could not explain why some descriptions mentioned paragraphs that changed position or lines of text that appeared without evidence of fresh ink. There is even one report of a page that in the evening described a city layout, but by morning contained notes on astronomical rituals. Imagine holding such a manuscript, feeling the calm of the room, yet sensing an uncertainty beneath it like an underground current. The scriptorial hall no longer stands intact, but its foundation remains among the ruins, and archaeologists describe a space that was likely extremely silent at night, so that any anomaly within it would imprint deeply on the memory of its watchers. All these narratives form an essential part of the Codex journey, showing that whatever occurred within the manuscript did not happen once, but repeated itself as though following the rhythm of something alive. In the mid-14th century, when education and commerce were expanding along the Saône River, mentions of the Codex began to appear in the travel journals of merchants and wandering scholars who glimpsed the manuscript during brief visits to the scriptorial hall. They did not know its origin, yet many wrote similar first impressions, a sense that the pages seemed to look back at them. Imagine a young scholar from the University of Paris traveling for research, stopping in the cold scriptorial room and approaching the table where the Codex lay open. He might have traced lines describing star arrangements while noticing that the letters appeared darker than the ink of other manuscripts. Nearby, as if freshly dried, even though the room had been silent for hours. One travel note mentions that when he closed the page, a faint sound, similar to an exhale, rose from the manuscript, causing him to turn, although no one else was in the room. You may imagine how such a small anomaly could be dismissed as travel fatigue, yet he still wrote it down, unable to shake the feeling that the manuscript held something unexplainable by the scientific understanding of the era. Some merchants transporting writing goods from Italy to Flanders also mentioned the Codex, though they saw it only briefly. They described its pages as carrying a thin layer of shadow that moved with light differently from other books on the shelf. At the time, many European towns were building semi-public libraries, and the demand for knowledge was rising. But a manuscript like this was considered too strange to be lent out, so it remained in a remote chamber, accessible only with permission from the monastery keeper. Picture yourself entering that room, feeling the temperature drop compared to the outer corridors, and seeing how that single, ordinary-looking object radiated a subtle pull, like a small center of gravity drawing the eyes of anyone who passed. These travel records suggest that the mystery of the Codex was not sensed only by monks, but by anyone who happened to encounter it, even if only once in their life. As we enter the early part of the main narrative and observe the daily activities surrounding the Codex, you can imagine how the monks in the scriptorial hall lived by a strict routine, yet still left room for small, inexplicable moments. Each morning they awoke before sunrise, then gathered in the prayer room for a brief devotion before beginning their work. The scriptorial chamber usually came alive around 6 when the first light entered through the small glass window and touched the cold wooden tables. Among the stacks of manuscripts awaiting copying, the Codex was always placed at the desk closest to the northern wall because it needed to be watched, though not handled frequently. Picture a young monk assigned to dust the room each morning, approaching that table hesitantly because he claimed to hear faint sounds like shifting paper even though no air entered the chamber. He touched the Codex cover with a soft cloth, then withdrew his hand slowly because he felt a faint warmth that should not exist on centuries-old parchment. Other daily activities, such as checking ink, sorting parchments, or repairing bindings, positioned the monks to see the Codex from a distance without daring to approach it directly. Imagine them working while occasionally glancing toward the open page as if waiting for some subtle change that might occur at any moment. Some monks attempted to observe the manuscript systematically by creating daily records of paragraph positions or ink patterns. But many of these reports ended abruptly, as though they lost the courage to continue. In the late afternoon, when sunlight weakened, the room became quieter, and in that quiet, the codex seemed heavier in presence, as if filling the space with a formless energy. These simple daily routines reveal how the manuscript remained the silent center of attention, never intentionally, yet always inevitably. Every small moment around it became an essential part of the mystery, spreading slowly like the scent of old ink that never fades. As days passed in the scriptorial hall, the monks began to realize that the codex seemed to possess its own rhythm, one that did not follow the movements of the people around it. Imagine how the room gradually shifted in atmosphere as midday approached, when sunlight slipped through the narrow window, making the air feel drier. At such hours, the pages of the codex often appeared stiffer, as if restraining the subtle motions heard during early dawn. Monks, responsible for safeguarding valuable manuscripts, would frequently pause near the table, not to examine it, but to make sure no sudden change was occurring. One old report mentions an archivist who saw the writing on one paragraph slowly fade as the ink was being drawn back into the parchment. He approached carefully, trying to determine whether it was merely a trick of the light, yet the longer he looked, the clearer the change became. Imagine him holding his breath, realizing that the content of the manuscript seemed not fixed, but following a process known only to itself. On certain days, when heavy rains soaked the region and the air grew humid, the codex behaved differently. Small droplets resembling dew appeared on the surface, though, never spreading or damaging the text, as if they were a thin, reactive layer between the ink and the atmosphere. Modern experts studying these accounts speculate about unique medieval ink compositions, yet still cannot explain the pattern changes that seem too consistent to be accidental. In that era, the monks relied more on intuition than theory, so they chose to leave the codex on its small table without further intervention. Believing human disturbance might worsen phenomena already difficult to explain. Picture the room growing quieter as afternoon approached, the fading light casting long shadows across the stone floor, while in the aft center, a single ancient manuscript continued to command attention, possessing a faint pulse not visible yet felt by anyone who drew near. All these small variations reinforce the belief that the codex was not a passive object, but an entity reacting to the world around it. 8 nights after you began observing the codex, you noticed something that at first seemed insignificant, yet now felt like a narrow doorway toward deeper understanding. At the lower edge of a page that had once been recorded by the librarians as missing, for an entire winter season, you saw a faint pattern resembling chalk scratches, usually formed by rough cloth brushing against parchment. But when you've lifted it toward the thin light slipping in through the arched window, that light revealed that the scratch was not a simple abrasion. It formed a neat curve, as if a patient, unseen hand had been tracing it slowly every night. Even as the air of the room remained still, you sensed that the form was not random. It was like a map pointing toward a focal point hidden within the text. You reread the section from the beginning with renewed clarity and found that the events recorded in the codex seemed to echo this curve. each tale of a monk tracking shifts of the season, or an astronomer measuring the arc of a star, followed a rhythm that mirrored the small pattern at the page edge. It was as if the text and the faint line repeated and perfected one another. Paleographers who studied it believe that the original writer attempted to merge visual form and written language into a unified system. Yet you sensed something deeper than such academic speculation. The following night, the pattern appeared slightly longer, like a line that had grown with imperceptible slowness. There was no rational explanation for this change, since no one had touched the codex after you returned it to its leather cradle. A faint vibration rose in your fingertips whenever you traced the mark. The sensation was not fear, but an awareness that the object carried an active process not compatible with anything considered inanimate. The codex seemed to breathe in a way that left no sound, no glow, no strange scent. All that existed was a steady, subtle alteration that never ceased leading you to wonder whether the manuscript was attempting to reorganize itself so its message could be understood in a deeper, quieter manner by anyone willing to approach it. On the 9th night, you entered the archive room with slower steps, as if your body instinctively understood that the codex had entered a more sensitive phase. The candle placed in the far corner did not flicker, and the air carried no sign of temperature. Change, yet as you approached, you felt a soft pressure that came from no physical source. It was as though the page before you was holding its breath, waiting for someone to touch its surface so its nightly cycle could continue. You opened again the page with a faint curved pattern and found that now a thin trail of ink extended toward the first sentence of a paragraph you had never seen before. The sentence was written in the same script used in the 14th century, yet it felt younger, fresher, as if it had been set down only hours earlier. You read the paragraph aloud in a whisper, so as not to disturb the quiet of the archive. It described a young scribe working in a narrow chamber lit by a single candle, who noted that whenever he stopped writing, he sensed that the text on another page moved ahead of him slightly like an unseen mentor, offering guidance. You realized the paragraph mirrored your own experience from the past several days. There was a sense that the codex did not merely recount the past, but rearranged and absorbed the re-experiences of anyone who observed it, making them part of the structure of the manuscript itself. You touched the edge of the page with great care, and in that moment, you felt a slow pulse. It was not strong and not unsettling, but rhythmic, like the breathing of a sleeping creature. The pulse made the thin trail of ink tremble softly, as if waiting for you to read further. You sensed an intuitive pull, urging you to turn more pages, yet you held back knowing that any change, however small, could influence the way the codex reorganized itself. Instead, you sat still and watched, letting the room return to its earlier silence. In that quiet, you realized you were no longer merely a reader. You had become an element recorded within the subtle motion the living manuscript created, even if you did not yet understand its purpose. On the 10th night, you decided not to touch the codex right away. You simply sat a few steps away, allowing your eyes to adjust to the darkness that shifted slightly with the fading candlelight. The archive room looked different that night. Normally, the air felt dry and clean, but now a subtle dampness crept quietly between the stones of the wall. There was no sound except your heartbeat, Yet the stillness carried the impression that the room itself was waiting not for you, but for something, emerging from the codex. When you finally approached and opened another page, you found a change so small yet significant. The page edge that had previously appeared still now displayed a thin sheen, as if ink had not completely dried, though you knew no writer had worked there for centuries. The sheen stretched toward the center of the page and stopped at a phrase that now appeared different from the previous night. The phrase described a scribe who began to hear what he called the whisper of ink. You tried to interpret its meaning, but no metaphor seemed appropriate. The phrase felt too literal to dismiss as stylistic language. You closed your eyes and listened to the silence. However, the silence gradually shifted into a vibration so low it was not heard but felt across your skin. The pattern flowed from the surface of the table into your hand and settled in your chest as though the text were examining your presence. When you opened your eyes, you saw a faint translucence appear beneath certain letters like a signal that the manuscript was selecting new phrases to reveal. You did not touch the page because you realized something essential. The Codex did not want to be read in a conventional way. It wanted to be observed. It wanted someone to remain quiet in the same stillness through which it worked in darkness. You leaned forward so your breath would not touch the surface and let it reorganize the part that seemed incomplete. You did not know how long you remained in that position, but when you finally took a deeper breath, you sensed that thousands of tiny details had shifted while you were still. The Codex was not merely changing words, it was adjusting itself to the rhythm of your observation. On the 11th night, you realized that time inside the archive no longer followed the same rhythm as time outside. When you entered the room, the sky still held the deep early night blue. Yet when you sat and gazed at the Codex without blinking, what felt like only minutes later, the candle you had lit had already melted to half its height. The change did not feel alarming, but more like a quiet adjustment, as though the room itself aligned with the rhythm of the ancient manuscript. The Codex lay open to a different page than the night before, even though you were below, certain you had not touched it after leaving it in the morning. On that page, a faint illustration depicted a robed figure riding near a window, but the shadow of the figure appeared clearer than the figure itself, as if the manuscript recorded the act of writing rather than the writer. You approached slowly and saw that the ink of the illustration shimmered subtly. You observed more closely and realized the shimmer was not a reflection of candlelight, but a movement that unfolded with extreme slowness. The lines of ink forming the shadow seemed to shift, gently rearranging themselves. You held your breath to avoid disturbing the process. At the edge of the illustration, a nearly faded annotation appeared. It described a scribe who worked at night when the monastery slept, and who began noticing that the shadow behind him wrote faster than he could. The note implied that the shadow belonged not to the man, but to the text that preceded the human hand. You returned your gaze to the illustration and became increasingly convinced that the Codex was presenting something reflective. It did not merely recount a past scribe. It was reenacting the condition before your eyes. With every breath you took, the ink lines of the shadow seemed to shift in harmony with your breathing. You leaned closer and felt the air grow heavier, though not oppressive. The weight felt like a presence moving slowly from the page toward you, seeking a method to communicate without speech. You closed your eyes and heard something faint, not like a voice from a living being, but like the soft friction of a quill gliding across parchment. When you opened your eyes, the ink lines of the illustrated shadow had changed position slightly, as though it had just written something you could not yet see. At that moment, you understood that the Codex was not merely rearranging its pages. It was adjusting the history recorded within it to meet your presence in the room. On the 12th night, you entered the archive no longer driven purely by observation, but by a desire to understand the pattern that had repeated since the first night. The candlelight appeared dimmer, although it had just been lit, yet the dimness did not come from the candle itself. It felt as though the room was absorbing light to preserve the quiet required by the Codex. As you approached, you sensed another change, even more subtle, yet unmistakable. The wooden table where the Codex rested was usually dry and scentless, but tonight there was a faint aroma reminiscent of tree resin mixed with fresh ink. The scent was not strong, but enough to make you feel as if someone had been writing there moments before your arrival. When you opened the next page, you found a new paragraph that had not existed previously. Its writing matched the style of the rest of the manuscript, yet something set it apart. The ink appeared darker, as though layered atop older strokes. You read softly, barely producing a sound, and discovered that the paragraph described an observer from long ago who noted that every alteration within the Codex occurred only when he restrained himself from touching it. He wrote that the pages seemed more willing to move and shape themselves when the person watching acted purely as a reflection without physical interference. The account made you realize that what you had experienced for several nights had been lived by someone centuries before you. A gentle vibration rose from the page. It did not disturb, but gave the impression that the Codex awaited your response, not through touch or speech, but through the silence you brought into the room. You leaned closer and noticed certain letters in the new paragraph appeared thicker than the rest, as if the Codex emphasized them deliberately. Those letters formed a phrase pointing to the bond between observer and manuscript, both moving within the same rhythm despite belonging to different eras. You closed the page slowly, but before your fingers left it completely, you felt something like a small pull, not from the material itself, but more like an invitation to remain within the unfolding pattern. You took a long breath and realized that the Codex was not only changing, was recognizing your presence and adjusting itself to the way you perceived time, space, and narrative. On the 13th night, you entered the archive with a new understanding that the Codex was no longer a passive object waiting to be read. Every step you took produced a soft echo against the stone walls, and the echo returned to you in a manner that felt slightly unnatural. It was as though the room adjusted the resonance of your footsteps to match the rhythm of the ink within the Codex. As you approached the manuscript, the candlelight formed a small, unmoving circle, even though the air seemed to ripple faintly. You realized the ripple did not come from the room nor from your body, but from the manuscript itself. The vibration resembled the subtle trembling of a water surface touched by wind, yet this time it was not water that trembled, but the time surrounding the pages. You opened the next page and noticed something different from the previous night. At the bottom of the page, a thin curved pattern appeared, resembling a trace of unfinished ink. But as you stared longer, you realized the pattern was actually forming a path like the shadow of a moving quill. Yet the quill did not belong to the past. The path moved slowly, as if tracing something not yet written. It depicted a process in motion, as though the Codex was preparing new text but waiting for your presence or movement to determine its direction. You leaned closer and felt a subtle shift in the air. The shift made the room feel slightly warmer, even though the candle remained unchanged. The warmth resembled the breath of something without lungs attempting to match your rhythm. At the edge of the page, a faint, mist-like ink appeared. It tried to form letters, but dissolved each time before becoming words. You understood the Codex was doing something different that night. It was not simply rewriting history or presenting experiences of past scribes. It was trying to compose words connected directly to your presence. When you closed your eyes, you sensed the ink pattern responding to your breathing. With each inhale, the pattern elongated, and with each exhale, it shortened. It was as if the Codex was learning how humans perceive the rhythm of time through their bodies. When you opened your eyes, the pattern had become a more defined line, as though it had chosen its initial form. You realized that the Codex was learning to write with you not as an object being observed, but as an entity responding to you in real time. On the 14th night, the change was no longer something you merely sensed. It manifested itself in ways impossible to overlook. The moment you entered the archive, the air, normally silent and undisturbed, carried a faint pressure, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The candle in your hand flickered once, not from any breeze, but as if reacting to your arrival. As you approached the stone table, you felt a strange recognition, almost as though the Codex knew you had come before you, consciously realized it yourself. When you opened the next page, the ink on its surface no longer lay dormant. A slow pulse moved from the margins toward the center, like a ripple traveling across a perfectly still lake at night. The pulse seemed to mirror the rhythm of your heartbeat, and when you held your breath to test whether you were imagining it, the pulse did not stop. If anything, it grew more defined, as if the Codex was reminding you that its rhythm was not dependent on your body, but that it chose when to align and when to assert its own. At the top of the page, a new trace of ink emerged, bolder than anything you had seen before. It curved, stretched, and thickened into shapes resembling letters, though not from any language you recognized. At a glance, the lines seemed like fragments of ancient scripts. But whenever you tried to associate them with something familiar, Greek, Aramaic, Coptic, even proto-pictographs, C-shifts shifted slightly, resisting classification. You realized something that had been slowly forming in your mind. The Codex was not imitating human language. It was constructing a new one, born from the interaction between your presence and the memories embedded within it. Every line carried a subtle resonance, a kind of meaning that did not rely on words, but on an unseen relationship communication operating beyond the bounds of linguistic understanding. The room grew warmer. You could not tell whether it was the intensity of the moment or whether the Codex itself was emitting a faint energy. When you touched the corner of the page with your fingertip, the ink flickered not, fading or dissolving, but shifting away, then returning as though acknowledging your touch, yet maintaining a cautious distance. On that night, something new emerged. The Codex was no longer merely writing with you, it was beginning to speak. Not through sound or text, but through transformations awaiting a response from your very presence. And for the first time, you understood the Codex was revealing not what it remembered, but what it wished to say. On the 15th night, the atmosphere of the archive shifted more dramatically than ever before. It was no longer merely warm or softly pulsating. It felt as though you had stepped into a place that was half alive, as though the stone walls themselves held a consciousness slowly awakening from a long slumber. As you entered, you sensed, if only for a moment, something watching from the dim corners of the room, not with suspicion or hostility, but with a quiet caution, like an ancient guardian judging whether you were worthy of continuing your interaction with the Codex. The candle in your hand dimmed, then flared back with a steadier glow than usual. It seemed as if the flame was being stabilized by an external will rather than the air around it. When you approached the stone table where the Codex always rested, you felt a gentle pressure along your skin, not breeze, not heat, but something that resembled a tension. The Codex was still closed, yet you sensed a subtle pulse moving through the air, as though it was setting the rhythm of the room before you even touched it. When you opened the next page, the pattern that emerged was unlike anything before. It was not merely a line, a curve, or the shadow of a quill's movement. The ink had arranged itself into a structure resembling a strange diagram, symmetrical, yet not entirely geometric. Organic, yet unlike any living creature. The pattern rotated slowly, shifting by only millimeters over several seconds, but enough for you to realize that the structure was not depicting something, it was searching for a form. What held you in place was how it reacted to your thoughts. When you imagined a circle, one of the arcs subtly curved toward that shape. When you pictured a straight line, another part of the pattern stretched ever so slightly. It was as though the Codex could sense the outline of your thoughts not as words, but as raw intention. Your heartbeat quickened. There was wonder, but also a sudden sense of responsibility. You realized the Codex was not imitating you, it was negotiating with you, seeking a mode of communication whose foundation was only just beginning. Then something happened that you had never seen. The ink at the center of the pattern seemed to sink into the page, then re-emerge as a tiny point, like an eye opening for the first time. You knew it was not a real eye, yet the impression that the Codex was looking at you was so strong that you held your breath. In that silence, you understood that the Codex had moved past learning your rhythm or building a new language. It had entered another stage, the stage of trying to understand who you are, not just your physical presence, but your thoughts, your doubts, your intention in returning night after night. And on the 15th night, for the first time, you felt that you are no longer simply reading the Codex. You were being read by it. On the 16th night, you stepped inside carefully, fully aware that each night brought a shift you could never predict. But tonight, something felt different, even before you reached the Codex. The air in the archive was denser, not heavy nor suffocating, but dense, as if the room was filled with an additional layer of awareness. It felt as though the space was no longer occupied only by you and the Codex, but by an echo of a thought that had no body. When you closed the door, the sound did not echo as it usually did. Instead, it sounded deeper, absorbed by the waiting pages. You approached the table and saw that the codex had opened slightly on its own, though you always left it closed. The small gap resembled a breath escaping from someone asleep, a sign that the manuscript had begun its nightly process before your arrival. When you touched the edge of its cover, you felt a faint vibration, almost non-existent, yet enough to tell you that the codex was more active tonight than on any previous night. When you turned to the next page, the ink pattern that resembled an eye was still there. But its position had shifted, and new lines radiated outward from it. These lines did not form straight or symmetrical curves. Instead, they moved subtly each time you blinked. Observing more closely, you realized the lines were not random. They were following your movements, not just your breath or pulse, but something subtler, the tiny unconscious rhythms your body produced. You stood perfectly still. The pattern froze instantly, like a creature awaiting instruction. When you moved your hand by just a fraction, the lines responded, shifting delicately to form a structure that seemed like an early attempt to understand your gestures. You realized that the codex was not simply observing tonight, was building a system to interpret your physical language. Then something small yet profound occurred. One of the ink lines thickened into a defined shape, then formed what appeared to be a letter. Not from any alphabet you knew, but resembling an early symbol from a newly forming system attempting to imitate human logic. A faint tremor passed through the stone table, as if the entire archive recognized the significance of the moment. You were unsure whether to feel proud, frightened, or amazed. But one truth was undeniable. The codex was moving toward something. It did not merely want to understand, it wished to begin a conversation. And that night, as you touched the page, the ink sharpened further, as if telling you that for the first time. It was not only you seeking to understand the manuscript, the codex wanted to be understood by you. On the 17th night, when you entered the archive, you immediately sensed that something had shifted beyond the evolving patterns or ink responding to your breath. This time, the change existed in the atmosphere itself, not only affecting your body, but touching your awareness. The candlelight dimmed not because of breeze, but as if adjusting itself to your arrival, casting the room into a soft, moving shadow, even though the walls remained still. For the first time, you noticed a faint scent drifting through the air like a blend of old paper, and something fresher, almost like the smell of a forest in the early morning after rain. The scent did not come from the candle or the archive. It came from the codex. As you approached the table, the open page revealed an ink pattern unlike anything from the previous nights. It was no longer made of small waiting lines, but formed into structures that resembled paragraphs, though without letters. You saw blocks of ink arranged in small columns, like text that had not yet discovered its language. What held you silent was the slow movement of one of the columns. It elongated, then shortened, as if synchronizing itself with the rhythm of your approach. The codex seemed to be attempting to imitate the shape of human paragraphs, not merely the shapes of letters. Suddenly, you heard a faint sound like paper touched by a thin breeze. But there was no breeze, and nothing else moved. You leaned closer and realized the sound came from within the page. as though beneath the surface there existed a hidden layer, shifting quietly. When you touched the edge of the sheet, you felt a soft pulse, like a distant heartbeat deep inside, something without a physical form. For a moment, the archive felt wider, as if it had opened a space that had never existed before. As you inhaled slowly, the ink in one of the columns flickered and spread into a new pattern, forming a long curved line. The line slowly shaped itself into something like the shadow of a landscape. You saw the hint of a hillside, then the suggestion of water and sky. You realized that the Codex was attempting to reveal something that was no longer language, but memory. A memory that might not have belonged to any human. In that moment, you felt both wonder and unease. The Codex was no longer simply imitating you or learning from your breath. It had begun to uncover what appeared to be its own recollection. And for the first time, you silently wondered whether what you had been reading was a manuscript or the memory of a being unknown to humankind. On the 18th night, you entered the archive with steps more cautious than before. As though your body understood that whatever awaited inside was no longer a mere continuation of shifting patterns, but a deepening dialogue between you and something previously unknown. As the old wooden door closed behind you, the room felt warmer, as if a presence had been waiting, not simply an object abandoned on a table. The candlelight, which had dimmed the night before, now appeared steady yet denser, as though each flame possessed a pulsing core like tiny, observing eyes. The shadows on the walls did not move. Instead, they seemed to hold themselves still, waiting for you to approach before deciding whether to shift. The scent in the room grew stronger still, reminiscent of wet forest air, yet now tinged with something that suggested growth or emergence, something alive in a way you could not name. When you looked at the Codex, the open page no longer displayed columns or blocks of ink imitating human paragraphs. Its surface now appeared layered, though the page remained thin to the touch. You saw patterns resembling a map that could belong to no known world-long sweeping arcs like territorial borders, clusters of dots like ghostly cities, and slow-moving lines that flowed like imaginary rivers. But what struck you most was the emergence of something resembling a figure. Not human, not animal, and not any form recorded in history. Just a vague silhouette, like the shadow of a being walking in the distance. Not fully formed, yet distinct enough to imply direction, intention, perhaps even will. It rose from the ink as if coming from a deeper place than the page itself. As you stared longer, the surrounding patterns widened, clearing like mist brushed aside by wind. For a moment, you sensed that the Codex was showing you someone or something that had once perceived a world, or perhaps another world entirely, through a mode that did not understand the limits of time. You could not tell whether this was memory, vision, or a message. What made your skin prickle was how the movement of the ink paused exactly when you inhaled, as if listening, waiting for your response. For the first time, you felt you were no longer reading the Codex. The Codex was watching you. And in the thick silence, you realized that the bond between you and it had crossed a threshold, one you might not be able to step back from. On the 19th night, before you even approached the table where the Codex lay open, You sensed that the room was no longer waiting as it had before. The room was welcoming you. There was something different in the way it wrapped itself around your awareness. Not merely a shift in atmosphere, but the emergence of another layer within the archive itself. A layer that now revealed its presence as though your continued visits had granted you permission to perceive it. The candles, usually steady and calm, now leaned forward slightly, their flames curving as if drawn toward the codex. The shadows on the walls moved slowly, not randomly, but following a pattern, circling, flowing, then halting precisely in alignment with the open page. It felt as though you were stepping onto a stage whose lighting had been arranged by an unseen hand. As you approached, the codex did not wait. The ink on its page stirred before you even touched the chair. The map-like structures from the previous night began dissolving, like boundaries melting under heat. They thinned, spread, and flowed into forms more fluid, more organic. In the midst of this transformation, the once vague silhouette of the being became clearer. Still faceless, yet now marked with faint lines suggesting bones or internal structure, nothing resembling the anatomy of any known creature. You held your breath when the ink pulse began not merely moving, but throbbing. The rhythm was steady, unmistakably similar to a heartbeat. Immediately afterward came a sound soft, not the rustle of paper or cloth, but something like a whisper without language. It did not come from the air. You felt it inside your head, like an echo vibrating between the page and your own thoughts. The codex seemed to be attempting communication. As the ink shifted again, a new shape emerged. Not a being, not a map, but something more unsettling. A row of vertical lines like a series of doors or, perhaps, fissures openings, that seemed as if they could be accessed if only you understood their meaning. Within these narrow slits, a thin shadow flickered, too quick for the eye, yet unmistakably alive. Then, without warning, one of the fissures formed something like an eye. Not a human eye, but a dark point that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, and it pointed directly at you. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, you understood something far larger. For nights, you believed you were studying the Codex. But the Codex, patient and deliberate, had in truth been studying you. On the 20th night, you entered the archive with a sensation that defied simple description, not fear. Not courage, but a heightened alertness that arises when someone realizes the boundary between observer and observed has begun to dissolve. Even before lighting an extra candle, the room had shifted. Light no longer gathered around the table. Instead, it spread thinly like drifting mist, filling every corner and creating the illusion that the walls expanded and contracted with your breath. The Codex remained where it always lay. Yet you sensed something stirring beneath its surface, like a pulse too faint to hear, but strong enough to feel on your skin. As you approached, the page moved, subtly, like a strand of hair caught in a non-existent breeze. You knew the room was silent. The movement came from the Codex. The vertical fissures from the previous night had widened. They no longer resembled tiny doors, but long ruptures, cracks in the surface of something trying to open. From within them emanated a thin light, not bright, but a sheen resembling moonlight reflected on wet metal. The light pulsed slowly, as if attempting to form communication before language. You sat down cautiously, steadying your breath, but the codex reacted before you could settle. The page trembled more intensely than on any previous night, lifting fine dust from the table. Then came something even stranger. One of the fissures emitted sound. Not the soft whisper from before, but an echo-like distant footsteps in a long corridor, a sound impossible to emerge from a sheet of paper. You closed your eyes for a moment, suspecting your mind of tricks. But when you opened them, the fissure had transformed into a narrow passage stretching inward, as though the page was no longer a surface, but a threshold into another place. At the far end of the passage, something shifted. Tiny, distant, yet unmistakably aware of you. Even without a face, you felt its gaze. The codex seemed to wait. Would you lean closer, allow your awareness to enter that corridor, or shut the page and end whatever had begun taking shape between it and you? But before any decision formed, something unexpected happened. The faint light from the fissure extended toward you, curling into a shape that slowly solidified into writing. In a language you had never seen, never heard, belonging to no world known to humans. The script quivered, as if urging you to try reading it. And for the first time, you sensed that if you understood even a single word, just one you might cease to be merely the reader of the codex and become part of something far stranger, older, and more alive than anyone could have imagined. On the 21st night, you entered the archive with steps far slower than the nights before. Not because you were afraid, but because you sensed that the codex was in a state that felt almost like waiting. A gentle tension filled the air, not the kind that urges retreat, but the kind that makes someone pause, listen, and acknowledge that something is preparing itself to appear. The candlelight rotated subtly, forming a thin circle in the air even though no breeze existed to cause it. You felt as if you were entering a space no longer merely an archive, but a transitional chamber where time and awareness touched without fully merging. Approaching the table, you found the codex open to the same page as the previous night, as though no moment had passed for it. Yet you knew that was impossible. You sensed that the page had changed even if its surface looked identical. The fissure that once resembled a narrow corridor now appeared deeper. The faint light emerging from it no longer shimmered passively, but pulsed gently like a heartbeat searching for a steady rhythm. You leaned closer and felt the room's temperature shifting. The cold that clung to the stone walls was replaced by a soft warmth, like the breath of some subtle presence standing near your shoulder. The unfamiliar writing that appeared the previous night was now more stable, its lines thicker, its curves firmer, and though the language was incomprehensible, you sensed a definite rhythm within it. When you focused on the first symbol, the light inside the fissure responded with a delicate vibration, as if acknowledging your attention. For the first time, you felt a gentle push from the codex, an invitation to read not with your eyes, but with intuition or something deeper than ordinary comprehension. You inhaled slowly. As air entered your lungs, the symbol stretched slightly, following the rhythm of your breath, then contracted when you exhaled. You realized the codex was aligning itself with your body's rhythm, creating a bridge, a subtle harmony between a creature of text and a creature of flesh. You touched the edge of the page and felt the pulse that was faint before now stronger, as if something wished to speak but needed a clearer channel. Then something entirely new happened. From within the fissure emerged, not just light, but a sound so soft it resembled a distant echo uttering. Something with a tone almost like a name. Not in any human language, nor in any decipherable tongue, yet the meaning seemed to approach you without passing through words. You pulled back slightly, not out of fear, but because you understood something crucial. The Codex was no longer imitating, adjusting, or learning. That night, it was calling you. Not with force, but with a summons that crossed the boundary between page and consciousness, urging you toward something long concealed. And you knew this night was not the beginning of understanding, but the beginning of a relationship moving into a realm untouched by human experience. On the 22nd night, you found yourself lingering unusually long at the doorway before entering the archive. There was a strange feeling blooming within you, not mere anticipation, but a sense of awareness that you had become part of something far larger than what you imagined when you first stepped into this room. Tonight the air felt denser, as if every particle carried a small memory of the silent exchanges between you and the Codex. The candlelight no longer simply illuminated the space. It seemed to highlight a path as though guiding someone who had only just begun to understand that this place operated under its own rules and intentions. As you approached the table, the Codex remained open to the luminous fissure, yet something had shifted. The light that pulsed softly the night before now formed more regular patterns, almost like waves responding to your footsteps. With every movement of your body, the glow receded, advanced, stretched, then drew back against, if studying you in the same way you were attempting to understand it. There was a mutuality now, a relationship no longer flowing in only one direction. The symbols on the page had also changed. Lines that were once straight now curved slightly, following patterns like slow-moving currents. You sensed something akin to a speech rhythm, or perhaps the pacing of a thought trying to create a bridge between two utterly different forms of existence. When you touched the page, the faint voice that had sounded like a distant echo became a little clearer. Not speakable, yet closer, warmer, as if attempting to form a phrase that might bypass language altogether. Then something surprising happened. The fissure widened not physically, but perceptually. It was as though the boundary between the paper's surface and the depth of light behind it began to loosen. You did not see another world or any creature forming, but you felt the presence of a space behind the glow, a space you had not previously imagined could exist. It felt like a place waiting for someone to enter, not with the body, but with the mind. In that moment, you understood that the Codex was not merely calling, it was opening, creating a subtle breach so that someone chosen could see further than any human was meant to see. That night, you were no longer simply an observer, but a potential participant in something untouched by history or memory. On the 23rd night, your steps feel different. They're no longer the slow pace of the night before, nor the hesitant pace of the earlier nights. Something akin to a subtle certainty grows within you, not because you understand the Codex, but because you realize it's now trying to understand you, too. The archives seem a little darker that night, as if the shadows have chosen to gather in the deepest corners to make room for the Codex's increasingly dominant light. Although the candles remain lit, their light seems to dim with each approach to the table, as if acknowledging the presence of another, more important source of light. As you stand before the Codex, you feel something you've never felt before: a pull. Not a physical pull, but a conscious pull, like an invisible thread connecting you to the depths of light within the pages. Its beat is clearer now, slow but sure, like a rhythm trying to align itself not just with your breath, but with your very thought patterns. The sensation makes you subconsciously re-regulate your breathing, as if your body is instinctively responding to a call coming from something that should be able to call. The symbols on the page change again. Tonight, the change is subtler, yet more profound. The lines that curved like a current last night now move slowly, flowing from one side of the page to the other, like an organism on the move. You no longer sense this as mere writing or a form of language. There's a sense of something alive, something adapting itself to find a form that can resonate with human perception. Each moving symbol leaves a thin trail of light, and you realize that the pattern forms something resembling a path, a kind of unfinished map. As you try to follow the light pattern with your gaze, a crack in the center of the page emits a subtle vibration that ripples through the air. The soft voice that 2 nights before had been a distant echo now sounds like a faint whisper, still incomprehensible, but closer to a form of communication that can penetrate your thoughts. You feel it, not in your ears, but in the back of your head, like a memory you never had that suddenly appears without needing words. Then a sudden change occurs. The light in the crack expands slightly, then recedes quickly, as if reacting to something beyond your will or its own. You feel a strange vibration in the air, a small but perceptible disturbance that makes the page seem momentarily. Shocked, for the first time, you realize that whatever is inside the Codex isn't always stable. Something else is influencing it. That night, you stand longer than usual, waiting to see if the vibration will return. And in the silence that stretches like a thin curtain, you sense one thing you couldn't ignore: that the relationship between you and the Codex has entered a new phase. A phase where it's not just you who's searching, but something else that's searching for you back, and that something else might not want it to happen. On the 24th night, you return to the archives, feeling more wary than ever. The strange vibrations of the previous night still linger in your memory, like an echo that hasn't quite died down. As soon as you push open the old wooden door, you immediately feel the room shift again, not lighter or darker, but more tense, as if 2 forces are holding their breath. The air feels thick, and you have to take a deep breath to keep your chest from tightening. The candlelight this time doesn't swirl or pulsate, but stands rigidly, as if restraining itself from something unseen. As you approach the table, the Codex is open, but not to the page you left off. It's a new one. You're sure you've never seen it before. The symbols are incomplete. Some appear as crooked, unfinished lines, while others form a circular pattern that seems to be avoiding a single blank space in the center of the page. the blank space isn't just an inkless area. There's something there. It's a small darkness, almost like a smudge of charcoal, but as you approach, it seems to pulse, as if breathing. You feel a chill creeping up from the empty space. Not like the stone cold of the archive walls, but a much older cold. A cold that comes not from the weather, but from nothingness. The light from the cracks in the previous page doesn't appear tonight. Instead, this new page seems to be trying to seal off something that's trying to seep in. You sense that the Codex isn't opening tonight's holding on. The unfinished symbols move slowly around the darkness in the center of the page, like tiny creatures guarding the center from an unseen threat. You try to touch the edge of the page, but before your finger reaches it, the entire ink pattern stops moving, frozen as if holding its breath with you. That's when you hear a subtle sound, not from the Codex, not from the room, but from the darkness itself. It's so soft, almost like a whisper that doesn't want to be heard, but strong enough to send shivers down your spine. A short, rhythmic murmur, and it doesn't follow the pattern of the Codex's previous calls. You take a step back. Not out of fear, not really, but because you sense that disturbing the page at this moment would be like opening the door to something even the Codex itself has tried to prevent. You realize that the strange vibrations from the night before weren't just a disturbance. They were an arrival. And tonight is the first time you see that the Codex, that creature of text that so desperately wants to understand you, also has an enemy, or at least something that's trying to penetrate it. In the hanging silence, you feel an invisible gaze, not from the Codex, but from that tiny darkness that seems to be assessing whether you're part of the obstacle or the entrance. On the 25th night, your steps toward the archive felt heavier, as though the stone floor of the corridor carried a weight that had not been there before. You tried to steady your breath, knowing that whatever awaited beyond the door was no longer a mere continuation of the phenomenon you had been studying, but something developing its own intention. When you pushed open the old wooden door, the room appeared to be holding its breath. No sound, no movement, and even the familiar scent of aged paper seemed muted, as if swallowed by something that refused to leave traces. The Codex remained open to the same page as the night before. The dark space at the center of the page had grown larger, deeper, like ink sinking into the fibers without limit. The symbols circling it now moved much more slowly, as though exhausted or under an invisible pressure. As you approached, you sensed something different. A gentle pull, not on your body, but on your awareness. It felt as if the darkness was ensuring that you focused on it above anything else in the room. You sat down carefully, keeping a measured distance from the page. At that moment, the candlelight trembled faintly, though the air was perfectly still. You noticed a small but undeniable change. The darkness in the center of the page began forming a thin line, stretching outward like a crack, searching for direction. It did not follow an organic pattern, nor the structure of writing. It grew in a way that resembled an unfinished map. Each time the line extended, the surrounding symbols stirred slightly, as if disturbed by its expansion. A faint impression reached you from the Codex, not through sound or light, but through a tension that gently tugged at your wrist. It felt as if the Codex wanted you to touch the edge of the page, offering a message it could no longer hold back. Yet at the same time, the darkness emitted a subtle vibration that felt like refusal. For a moment, you understood that you stood between two wills. The Codex was seeking assistance while something else was demanding distance. Then something unexpected occurred. One of the symbols closest to the dark space began to crack from within. The ink forming its curve fractured into fine lines as if strained by pressure. From the tiny fissure emerged a narrow beam of light unlike any you had seen within the Codex. It was not warm or gentle. It was a thin sliver of something attempting to escape. In that moment, you realized something that had never crossed your mind. The Codex was not merely revealing memory or awareness. The Codex was containing something, and with each night you returned, the barrier holding it back was growing weaker. On the 26th night, when you re-entered the archive, something felt different, not because of what had visibly changed, but because of what was being concealed. The air no longer merely rested in silence. It seemed to hold something within itself, like a hollow chamber storing an echo that had not yet been permitted to sound. The candlelight, which normally flickered gently, now bent subtly toward the table as if drawn by a new gravitational center you could not see but could feel deep in your bones. The Codex remained open on the same page, but the page no longer lay flat. Its surface dipped slightly inward, as though being tugged from the very center of the darkness. The symbols encircling the black fissure looked tangled, like ranks of small creatures losing their formation under invisible pressure. As you approached, you felt, for the first time, as though the Codex itself were holding its breath. The dark fissure at the center of the page was no longer passive. Its edges pulsed in a slow rhythm, thickening and thinning like a delicate membrane responding to something moving beneath it. The faint beam of light that had escaped the fractured symbol the night before now shone brighter, and, to your alarm, the effect was spreading. For other surrounding symbols now bore fine cracks, each releasing a sliver of the same pale radiance. It felt as if whatever lay beneath the page was applying pressure outward, searching for weaknesses wherever it could find them. You placed your hand on the edge of the table, not for balance, but because a gentle pressure seemed to brush against you like a question carried by air. The Codex seemed to ask for your attention without urging you closer, as though it knew that a certain distance was the last remaining safeguard. You leaned forward carefully, trying to perceive the activity beneath the surface. There was no sound, yet you sensed a faint vibration, no longer shaped like breath or heartbeat. This vibration had structure, intention like footsteps moving behind a thin wall. Then something began to emerge from the darkness, not light, not ink, but a blurred form resembling a shadow. It moved slowly, like the silhouette of a figure walking behind a translucent curtain. You could not see its features, but you felt its presence, a will long confined, now brushing against the weakening boundaries of its containment. At that moment, your breath tightened with the realization. You were no longer the only one observing the Codex. Something inside the Codex was observing you in return. On the 26th night, when you re-entered the archive, something felt different, not because of what had visibly changed, but because of what was being concealed. The air no longer merely rested in silence. It seemed to hold something within itself, like a hollow chamber storing an echo that had not yet been permitted to sound. The candlelight, which normally flickered gently, now bent subtly toward the table as if drawn by a new gravitational center you could not see but could feel deep in your bones. The codex remained open on the same page, but the page no longer lay flat. Its surface dipped slightly inward, as though being tugged from the very center of the darkness. The symbols encircling the black fissure looked tangled, like ranks of small creatures losing their formation under invisible pressure. As you approached, you felt, for the first time, as though the codex itself were holding its breath. The dark fissure at the center of the page was no longer passive. Its edges pulsed in a slow rhythm, thickening and thinning like a delicate membrane responding to something moving beneath it. The faint beam of light that had escaped the fractured symbol the night before now shone brighter and, to your alarm, the effect was spreading. For other surrounding symbols now bore fine cracks, each releasing a sliver of the same pale radiance. It felt as if whatever lay beneath the page was applying pressure outward, searching for weaknesses wherever it could find them. You placed your hand on the edge of the table, not for balance, but because a gentle pressure seemed to brush against you like a question carried by air. The codex seemed to ask for your attention without urging you closer, as though it knew that a certain distance was the last remaining safeguard. You leaned forward carefully, trying to perceive the activity beneath the surface. There was no sound, yet you sensed a faint vibration no longer shaped like breath or heartbeat. This vibration had structure, intention like footsteps moving behind a thin wall. Then something began to emerge from the darkness, not light, not ink, but a blurred form resembling a shadow. It moved slowly, like the silhouette of a figure walking behind a translucent curtain. You could not see its features, but you felt its presence, a will long confined, now brushing against the weakening boundaries of its containment. At that moment, your breath tightened with the realization. You were no longer the only one observing the codex. Something inside the codex was observing you in return. On the 27th night, you entered the archive more slowly than usual, not out of hesitation, but because your body seemed to instinctively adjust to something that had arrived before you. The air felt heavier, like a thick curtain hanging low and forcing every breath to pass through an unnamed presence. The candles in the corners looked shorter than the night before, not as though burned down, but as if they had shrunk under invisible pressure. But the clearest change was not in the air, was in the way the room regarded you. Every time you stepped forward, the shadows on the walls moved just a fraction slower than your body, lagging behind with a precision too deliberate to be accidental. The silence that once defined the archive remained, but it was no longer empty. It was dense, as if someone or something was waiting for you to speak first. When your eyes found the table where the codex lay, you saw immediately that the page had shifted again. The dark fissure at its center had widened not dramatically, but enough that the surrounding symbols now appeared strained, pulled taut as though resisting pressure from beneath the parchment. The cracks in those symbols glowed more brightly, and the light was no longer white. It had the sheen of metal polished to the point of distortion, glimmering like something alive beneath layers of ink. The shadow you saw the previous night was clearer now, still blurred, but its form had sharpened, tall, with shoulders that expanded slowly, like a being still deciding what shape it wished to assume. It moved within the fissure with a rhythm unlike human steps or any animal's gait. Its movement resembled a breath forced into form. As you approached, the faint vibration from the table shifted into a gentle push, subtle, yet intentional, like two magnets recognizing one another after years of separation. You felt an awareness that was not your own brush against the edge of your mind, not invasive, but studying, as if trying to understand the architecture of human thought. It felt like being touched by something with no hands, but with overwhelming attention. Then, from within the fissure, a voice that was not a voice emerged. Not a hiss, not a whisper, but an idea vibrating directly into your consciousness. You can finally see. And without needing to look around, you knew the truth. The boundary between observer and observed had begun to collapse. On the 28th night, your approach toward the Codex felt like stepping onto a razor. Edge between bravery and foolishness, not because you were unaware of the danger, but because now, inexplicably, you felt summoned rather than merely compelled. The room, once cold, began to emanate a faint warmth, though it was anything but comforting. It felt like the slow exhale of something large and unseen residing just beyond the threshold of perception. The candles no longer cast steady flames. Instead, each flame leaned inward toward the table, forming a subtle circle of converging light. Your shadow split into two, each slightly out of sync, as though two versions of you attempted to occupy the same time and space. As you approached the table, the page of the Codex pulsed more visibly. Each pulse lifted the parchment a few millimeters before letting it settle again, a small motion, yet unmistakably alive. The book was no longer merely an object. It felt like a membrane covering something breathing beneath it. The dark fissure at the center no longer simply existed, flickered like an eye attempting to open without revealing its full gaze. Along its edges, lines of molten-like light shimmered, bending into curves and patterns that obeyed no human logic. The shadow within the fissure moved more freely now. You saw it turn not toward the symbols, not toward the light, but toward you. And what made you step back was not the movement itself, but the deliberateness of its halt. It behaved as if suddenly aware that you were not merely witnessing the process, you were part of it. A faint tremor spread through the room, not from the table this time, but from the shelves themselves. Thousands of aging manuscripts rustled, their pages whispering like lungs releasing a sigh centuries in the making. Something within the archive was responding to the entity inside the Codex, as though the room recognized it. Then the fissure changed. It stretched not only downward, but outward like a rip being pulled open by invisible hands. The metallic light seeped from the widening edges, scattering across the table in trembling reflections. And again, an idea formed inside your mind, sharper, clearer than before. You called me more than you knew. You took a slow breath that felt far too heavy. Tonight, you realized the truth. Not only was the thing inside waking, the Codex itself was beginning to transform, and you were standing at the center of its awakening. On the 29th night, before you could light the first candle, the room greeted you with a glow that came from no flame. A faint blue-silver radiance wrapped itself around the table where the codex lay, soft yet strong enough to erase shadows from the corners. The light pulsed slowly, echoing the rhythm you could now recognize instinctively, the heartbeat of something awakening beneath the page. You inhaled, realizing you hadn't meant to. The archive no longer felt like an archive. It was shifting, subtly, but undeniably, into something governed by a different order. The ceiling appeared higher than before, the walls drawn back slightly, as though the room was expanding to accommodate the presence growing within it. As you approached, the page moved more actively than the night before. It didn't merely pulse, it rippled, like water reacting to a vibration below its surface. The fissure had widened enough for you to glimpse what lay within. It was no void, but a corridor unfinished, its walls streaked with flowing metallic light, curving in patterns no human geometry could fully grasp. The figure within the fissure had gained shape. Its silhouette was more defined, as if it were forcing itself through layers of reality. You saw the suggestion of a head, a long neck shifting slowly, and shoulders now solidifying not human in exact proportion, yet echoing humanity as though reconstructed from fragmented memory. As you stood only steps away from the table, a pressure brushed your chest. It wasn't wind or vibration, but something measuring your breath, your pulse, the tremors of thought at the back of your mind. For the first time, you sensed the codex was not merely opening a path for the being. It was opening a path to you. The surrounding symbols fractured further, releasing streams of metallic radiance that crawled across the table, forming a living pattern. A circle emerged, resembling an ancient mandala, yet shifting, constantly expanding, contracting, adjusting to the creature's rhythm. Then, a new impression entered your mind. Not a sentence images, a stone gate, a sky swirling like a whirlpool, and a hand pressing onto a book's page. Not your hand. Someone else's? Someone long gone. And from the depths of the fissure, a thought came through, stronger than all those before. The path is unfinished. You must complete it. The room felt as though it subtly turned around you. This night was no longer about what was emerging from the codex. It was about what the codex was beginning to demand from you. On the 30th night, you stood at the edge of the table like someone holding the key to a gate without knowing whether to turn it. The echo of the message that entered your mind the previous night still sounded like a bell in an empty hall. The unfinished path, the vague but urgent demand, all felt like a test requiring an answer. Your breathing slowed and lengthened because the room seemed to hold its breath, awaiting your decision. In your mind, you pictured who had once pressed that page before you. You imagined a scribe or guardian from a distant time who may also have been summoned to continue the path and perhaps failed or succeeded at an unimaginable cost. Empathy rose beside a sense of duty. You knew that choosing to step forward meant opening something that might not be closed again. Withdrawing was not without consequence either. For every night, the presence inside the codex grew stronger, and waiting indefinitely could erode the boundary between manuscript and the outside world. You moved closer, gathering a small courage, and place the palm of your hand on the page edge. The paper felt warm, almost like skin awaiting touch. As your finger made contact, the mandala pattern on the table pulsed as if acknowledging recognition. The images in your head shifted from picture into a stream of story that used no words, yet carried meaning. You saw the stone gate rise higher, the sky vortex harden into a path, and the hand pressing on a book page as an action that initiated a journey. There was a subtle urging to follow the path not with your body, but with thought and intention. The Codex demanded your participation to assemble a missing fragment to bridge the memory of the being behind the darkness and the world that knew you. When you focused the intent to write, the ink responded. Fractured lines became defined trails, and surrounding symbols rearranged like fingers aligning a map. A current of energy passed along your spine, not painful, but like a gentle pulse connecting you to something vast. In that moment, you realized completing the path was not only about opening a door for that being. It was about reorganizing forgotten parts of history, filling empty spaces with new understanding that might change whoever reads the Codex in future. The decision felt heavy. You closed your eyes briefly, inhaled deeply, then opened them and began to write, not with an ordinary pen, but with an active will that the living ink answered by forming words before you. You knew the path was unfinished, and tonight you chose to be part of its completion. On the 31st night, the writing you had formed with intention the previous evening had not fully settled, though it was not ordinary ink. It lingered like something breathing. When you returned to the room, you found the Codex in a new state. The page you had written now pulsed with two rhythms, the rhythm of the being within the fissure and your own. They were not in perfect harmony, but they drifted toward it like two tones, searching for alignment in a space not yet stable. The room mirrored that transformation. The blue-silver glow that once rested on the tabletop now spread across the floor like a thin layer of liquid mist. Every step you took triggered ripples that glided outward softly. You could not tell whether the room was observing you or merely adjusting itself to something unfolding within the Codex. As you approached the table, the page reacted, acknowledging your presence. The living ink began to move, reorganizing itself, thickening certain strokes, erasing others, as though refining what you had written with feedback from the being behind the fissure. It wasn't correction or rejection, but collaboration, two entities shaping a map toward the same destination from different angles. Something in the open fissure drew your focus. Its interior had changed. No longer just a corridor, but a structure resembling a crossroads. Metallic streams of light branched outward like luminous veins. Each path pulsed with a slightly different hue, radiating different sensations: calm, fear, memory, and something resembling nostalgia for a place you had never visited. Then something touched your mind clearer than the night before. Not a voice or words, but orientation, a subtle urging to choose one of the branching paths. You sensed that the choice was not merely about the being's direction, but also your own journey toward understanding the Codex's purpose. There was no command, only invitation. Yet the invitation carried its own gravity, compelling you to weigh the options carefully. Suddenly, the space around you shifted focus, as though the walls dissolved into faint mist. Only the table, the codex, and the glowing crossroads remained crisp and real. You wondered whether you were still standing in the same room or already stepping into a domain shaped by the manuscript itself. And within the rhythm of the light, you sensed something new. The being behind the fissure was no longer simply waiting. It was beginning to follow the direction of your choice. Tonight, it was your turn to take the first step. On the 32nd night, you noticed something you had never realized before. The door closed behind you the moment you stepped inside silently, without breeze or movement. As if the room itself wanted to ensure that no path backward existed until you understood what you were meant to face. There was no sense of being trapped. Instead, there was the far heavier sensation of being selected. The blue-silver glow on the floor had shifted into flowing patterns, drifting like currents of water that all converged toward the same point. The codex, and on the table, the page containing the luminous crossroads had transformed further. The metallic paths that once seemed separate choices now appeared subtly connected at their far ends, hinting that no matter which direction you selected, the journey would eventually converge only through different trials. As you approached, the gentle pressure returned to your chest warmer this time, almost reassuring, like a quiet hand placed on your shoulder. You understood instantly that tonight was not merely about choosing a path, but entering one. The fissure widened, opening twice as far as before. No longer a crack, but a thin doorway that had stopped waiting for permission. Behind it, the creature revealed more of its form, the curve of shoulders becoming solid, elongated arms supporting its rise, and the subtle tilt of its faceless head adjusting to a human orientation. It had no visage, yet its presence felt more focused than ever, its entire body observing you. Then something shifted. The glowing pathways on the page stopped pulsing and stilled completely, like carved etchings awaiting activation. You felt an intuitive pull, and before your mind caught up, your hand moved your fingertip, touching the nearest path. The one radiating a faint warmth unlike the others, which felt cold, distant, or impossibly deep. Your touch ignited the path. Heat spreads gentle, like touching stone warmed by the sun. Light flowed outward from the point of contact, following the line like liquid ink, responding to your pulse. The entire path lit up, sending a trembling shimmer toward the fissure. The being moved, not crawling, following the path you selected. Its body flowed, drawn forward by your decision. The mandala-like pattern on the table rotated slowly, and the room seemed to hold its breath. A new clarity settled into your mind, no longer fragmented, no longer uncertain. You chose the first step. Now I must walk it with you. And for the first time, you felt not simply the presence of the being, but the beginning of a bond between you. The 34th night began with a stillness so perfect it became unsettling. When you approached the archive, no light leaked from beneath the door. No faint patterns shimmered on the floor. No whisper greeted your presence. Everything felt too calm, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for you to make a choice that had been inevitable from the start. When you touched the door handle, a cold sensation traveled up your arm, not the cold of metal, but a sentient chill, as if something was examining you, confirming your readiness. The door opened without a sound, and the moment you stepped inside, the room awakened. Not with chaotic gleams or gentle tremors as before. The light now pulsed steadily, synchronizing with your heartbeat. The floor was covered in radiant patterns, but they no longer followed your steps. Instead, they formed a vast circle in the center of the room. At the heart of that circle, the table and the codex appeared like an altar, the focal point of the archive's entire energy. The creature had advanced further. Its torso now emerged from the fissure, and a luminous, spine-like structure quivered faintly, as though preparing or waiting for something. Though still faceless, the pressure in the air made you feel its attention, not suspicious, but expectant. As you moved closer, the circle of light accelerated its pulse. A low hum filled the room, reminiscent of an ancient machine awakening after centuries. The glowing path from earlier shifted, forming a bridge of light between you and the codex, a path you were meant to walk. Your steps felt heavy as you ascended the luminous bridge. Each footfall released a burst of sparks that floated upward before dissolving. When you reached the table, the creature lifted its hand, not to touch you, but to direct your gaze toward the codex. A new symbol had appeared on the page. It did not glow. Instead, it absorbed the surrounding light, pulling at your thoughts rather than your body. You felt it reaching into your mind, opening doors within you that you had never noticed before. Then the voice came again, clearer, more human than ever. Yet still soundless. For the meeting to occur, you must unlock the part that only you possess. And you understood that the 34th night was not about the creature's emergence, but about what you must release to allow it to fully enter your world. The 35th night began with a nervousness you could no longer hide, even though the room itself appeared calmer than before. The circle of light from the previous night had transformed into something more intricate, a living mandala of shifting lines, each stroke breathing with a rhythm that felt almost organic. When you stepped inside, the mandala greeted you with a faint pulse, as if acknowledging that you had finally reached the threshold of true understanding. The creature had emerged almost halfway from the fissure. Its form had sharpened. The glowing spine that once seemed ethereal now resembled a chain of crystalline segments, each emitting a soft pulse that aligned with the mandala below. Its arms were more defined, its torso more imposing, not merely crossing into your world, but seemingly being sculpted by the room and its luminous architecture. The codex trembled faintly on the table, though no breeze touched it. The dark symbol that appeared the previous night had changed, its edges cracked like melting ink, revealing a faint red glow beneath. You felt a powerful urge to touch it, even as your instincts warned that such an action would shift the course of everything that had unfolded. The soundless voice returned, closer this time, as though whispering from just behind your ear. There is something within you that must be released. Not memory, not emotion, but a door. You didn't understand at first, but then the mandala on the floor began to rotate slowly, opening small gaps between its shifting lines. In those gaps, you didn't see images, but feelings. The earliest fear you had as a child. The moment you realized the world was larger than your understanding, the grief you buried so deeply it ceased to have language. The room didn't force your choice, simply waited. The creature lifted one radiant arm, pointing toward the dark symbol on the codex. A subtle vibration stirred within your chest, urging you toward the page, toward the decision that would unlock something long sealed, not by time, but by your own will. As your fingers approached the codex, the room dimmed slightly, as though the entire archive inhaled in anticipation. You understood that to touch the symbol was to accept a role that could never be undone, a connection between you and the creature that reached deeper than comprehension. But it wasn't fear you felt. It was recognition. The knowledge that your journey had just stepped into a realm far greater than the birth of a single entity. The 36th night began without sound, not because the room was silent, but because everything inside seemed to be holding still, waiting for the decision you had yet to make. When your finger finally touched the dark symbol on the codex, the world did not erupt, tremble, or fracture. Instead, the room became utterly still, eerily calm, like the surface of a lake that suddenly freezes in place. Your touch released a flash-not light, but something subtler, a pulse of heat spreading from your fingertip up your arm. You felt the symbol yield beneath your touch, like a door recognizing the hand that holds its key. A thin red line seeped from the cracked edges of the symbol, flowing outward like living ink, forming new patterns that danced across the page. The creature responded immediately. Its upper body tightened, then glowed brighter, as if the energy you released had crossed the dimensional divide and seeped into its form. The red glow from the symbol traveled into the creature's crystalline spine, weaving itself into intricate patterns across its incomplete body. You felt the connection, a bridge that now linked the two of you. The mandala on the floor shifted. Its rotating lines stretched outward, branching like roots of light from the point where you stood. These roots extended into the walls, the shelves, the ceiling, carrying the same faint red glow that pulsed from the symbol. The archive now resembled a massive mechanism finally roused from centuries of slumber. Then an unfamiliar sensation crept along your spine, not cold, not heat, but the sharp clarity of awareness. Something inside you moved, like a door slowly opening from within. You didn't know what was emerging through that door, what was entering, but you knew one truth. Something had changed irrevocably. For the first time, the creature lifted its head. Though it still lacked a face, you sensed an expression. There's something like recognition. It no longer regarded you as a witness, but as part of itself, or part of the process shaping it. The soundless voice returned, clearer now, as though speaking from inside your skull. You have opened your door. Now the world must open its path. The room trembled softly, not from the creature this time, but from you. And for the first time, you understood the Codex was not only awakening the entity, it was awakening something within you. The 37th night felt unlike any before, as though the archive and everything within it held its breath, awaiting the climax of a process that had unfolded over weeks. The mandala's light was now steadier, radiating a soft red hue blended with the silvery blue glow that had previously filled the room. Every movement you made caused the lines of light to resonate, as if the entire archive were a living organism, breathing with you and the creature in the codex. The creature was now almost entirely out of the fissure, standing atop the pages with awe-inspiring proportions. Though its face remained undefined, you felt its presence fully the density of will, an energy impossible to describe in words. Its arms moved slowly, swinging with a rhythm that seemed to await instruction, not from your conscious thought, but from the connection forged between you. The codex trembled gently beneath it, its pages reflecting the light that coursed across the creature's form. The dark symbol you had touched the previous night had opened wider, releasing new streams of light that ran across the table, reaching the floor and merging with the mandala. You realized that each symbol touched was creating a larger, more complex, living pattern, like an ancient language finally finding its speaker. A wave of consciousness passed through the room, not a sound, not a shadow, but perception that touched your mind directly. From within, a clear and firm idea emerged. You are not merely the conduit. You are the mover. These words were not spoken. They were received, penetrating to the core of your being. You gazed at the creature, feeling a subtle urge to step forward, to participate in the process you had just touched. Your body responded instinctively, step by step approaching, following the rhythm of the mandala, following the pulse, connecting symbol to symbol. The vibrations in the air grew stronger, and the ancient shelves seemed to resonate with the energy flowing from floor to ceiling, binding the entire archive into a single living network. And in that moment, you understood. Tonight was not merely the birth of the creature. Tonight marked the birth of a new relationship, a symbiosis between human and codex, between observer and observed, between knowledge and consciousness that had never before been reached. The 38th night arrived with a clarity sharper than any before. The archive was now fully alive, yet not frightening rather. It felt sacred, like an ancient temple built not for humans, but for knowledge waiting to be awakened. The glowing mandala on the floor pulsed gently, spreading energy throughout the archive, while the creature stood tall atop the codex, its body nearly fully formed, cute, radiating a rhythm of light that mirrored your own breath. As you stepped closer, the pressure you had felt in your chest transformed into a warm, calming vibration, as if the room itself whispered, "This is your moment. Take your role completely." You sensed a profound connection with the creature, not a mere observer-object relationship, but a symbiosis, a bond forging a new consciousness between you. The codex lay ready, its pages quivering softly, waiting for the touch that would close the circle of this long journey. You bent slowly, your fingers touching the symbol that had once warned you. As contact was made, light spread across the mandala, a wave of luminous energy enveloping both you and the creature. The room seemed to pause, and then you realized the being was no longer something emerging from the codex. It had become a part of your reality, extended and amplified through the connection between human, book, and light. In the silence, the soundless voice spoke one final time, clear and serene. You have transcended observation. You are the guardian and the bearer of this path. Together, we have only just begun. You inhaled deeply, feeling the entire room resonate with the new presence that had been created. Every book, every shelf, every shadow was now a witness. Part of a process that did not merely transform the creature in the Codex, but transformed you as well. That night, you did not simply witness the birth of a new entity, you experienced the birth of a relationship between human and knowledge, between consciousness and mystery that could never be fully comprehended. The archive, once static and silent, was now alive in perpetuity, holding not only pages but experience, awareness, and infinite potential. And you knew, for the first time, that the long journey had found its purpose, not merely understanding, but full engagement, acknowledgement, and a role that would continue to evolve with time.